Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
American homeowners are sitting on $30 trillion in home equity. But home insurance is up over 100% since 2010. Healthcare, childcare, property taxes, all up. But wages? Just stuck. Lots of equity, but feeling the squeeze. Every month they wonder why it still feels so tight. Unlock thinks we need to talk about this more. Start at unlock.com/equity. Unlock Home Equity Solutions and MLS 2657081.
Welcome to Geekstorians, the show that digs into the stories behind the stories, the industrial decisions, the cultural pivots, the near collapses, and the strange things people built out of the wreckage. I'm Dave from Geektown. For the first 2 seasons, we've been following a pattern. Season 1 was about construction, how geek culture built itself from the margins. In the letters pages, fanzines, conventions, video shops, fan clubs, and all the strange little rooms where obsessives found each other and realised they weren't alone. Season 2 was about survival. The bankruptcies, the cancellations, studio interference, technological accidents, and terrible decisions that somehow failed to kill the things people loved. At the end of that season, one door was left open. Season 3 is about to walk through it. This is the conquest. The moment geek culture stopped being a subculture and started becoming the culture. When the things built by fans, obsessives, and people who were openly laughed at for caring too much became the dominant force in global entertainment. It didn't happen naturally, and it definitely didn't happen neatly. This season is about how the margins became the machine, and we begin with the moment the whole thing changed. This is the house that Iron Man built. April 2018. A cinema somewhere. It could be anywhere. The film has been running for 2 hours and 26 minutes. And on the screen, something extraordinary is happening. Thanos, the villain the Marvel Cinematic Universe has been building towards for years, has done exactly what he came to do. The Infinity Gauntlet on his fist, all 6 stones in place. He snaps his fingers, and the heroes start to die. Not the villain, not the supporting cast, the heroes. The characters audiences have spent a decade with, the ones they've loved, argued about, dressed up as for Halloween, bought toys of, queued at midnight to see. Bucky Barnes turns to dust. T'Challa, the Black Panther, disintegrates. Peter Parker looks at Tony Stark and says, "I don't want to go." And then he's gone. The cinema is completely silent. Not upset silent, not gasp silent, just quiet. The specific quiet of an audience that has no framework for what it's just watched happening inside a Disney blockbuster. Half the universe gone. Credits roll, house lights come up. Nobody's quite sure what to say. And that silence is the point. Because underneath the disbelief, underneath the shock, underneath the strange grief of watching fictional characters dissolve in front of you, there is a question hanging in the room. Who planned this? Who looked at one of the most profitable franchises in Hollywood and decided the right move was to end the film by killing half the cast? And how exactly did they persuade a studio to let them do it? If you were here for Season 2, Episode 4, you already know the first half of this story, but a quick recap. The Marvel fire sale, the bankruptcy, the rights scattered to Sony, Fox, and anyone else willing to write a check in a run of desperation deals that now look like pricing a Rembrandt at a car boot sale. At the end of it, the characters know what he wanted. Iron Man, Thor, Captain America. The ones left behind after the valuable pieces had already gone. Which is still one of the funniest parts of the entire story. Marvel didn't launch the modern entertainment machine with the crown jewels. It launched it with the stuff left in the drawers after everyone else had finished looting through the house. Marvel took out a $525 million loan from the bank Merrill Lynch, secured against the rights to characters nobody else had bothered to option. It then bet the company on a first film that had to work, because if it failed, the bank took those characters and Marvel lost what little it still owned. Iron Man opened on the 2nd of May 2008. It made $585 million. Robert Downey Jr. rebuilt his career in a single performance. And then, after the credits, a man stepped out of the shadows in Tony Stark's living room and mentioned something called the Avengers Initiative. We covered all that. What we didn't cover was what came next, the harder part. Not what was built, but how. Not the accident that created the opportunity, but the discipline that made use of it. Because here's the thing about what Kevin Feige did between 2008 and 2019. It was not an accident. He had a plan. And to be clear, Feige didn't build it all alone. Nobody builds something this large alone. Directors, writers, producers, casting teams, editors, visual effects artists, actors, thousands of people made this thing function. Jon Favreau set the tone. Robert Downey Jr. gave the whole machine its first heartbeat. Screenwriters Marcus and McFeely helped give the saga its spine. The Russos turned the crossover into a finishing move. But Feige's role was different. He held the shape in his head. He kept the machine pointed at the direction. Not just a producer standing near a whiteboard saying phase with the confidence of a man who's recently learned the word synergy. I mean an actual plan. The idea was to do something cinema had never really done before. Comics had done it for decades. Shared continuity, interconnected titles, characters moving in and out of each other's stories, events in one book affecting another, a world that felt cumulative, as though it existed beyond the edges of any single issue. Readers of Marvel Comics had understood that logic for years. Cinema hadn't. Not seriously, not structurally. Not with the specific intention of building a long-form narrative across multiple films over multiple years, with the confidence that the payoff would only work if audiences had followed the whole road to get there. The studios holding Marvel characters at the time, Sony, Fox and the rest, were making franchise films, sequels, reboots, occasionally very good ones, sometimes even brilliant ones. But Marvel Studios, under Feige, was attempting something very different. It wasn't making films that shared a brand. It was building a universe that shared a memory. And the specific trick, the thing that made Phase 1 feel different from every failed imitation that came after, was that the connective tissue wasn't plot. It was character. Yes, the Infinity Stones became the running MacGuffin. The Tesseract, the Ether, the Power Stone, the Mind Stone in Loki's scepter, all the cosmic glowing paperwork required to hold the larger architecture together. But architecture isn't emotion. What brought people back wasn't the stones. It was Tony Stark, Steve Rogers, Natasha Romanoff. It was characters built carefully enough that audiences cared less about what the device did than about what it would cost the people holding it. The Infinity Stones told you how the universe connected. The characters told you why it mattered. And only one of them keeps people turning up for 11 years. The structural decisions that made all of this possible, the ones Feige made early and never really abandoned, was phase planning. Not film by film or sequel by sequel. Not waiting to see what worked and then pretending like it was a strategy all along. Deliberate chapters with a beginning, an end, and a specific emotional destination. Phase 1 ends with the Avengers assembling. Phase 2 ends with the team damaged, divided, and less certain of itself. Phase 3 ends with the team broken, the universe nearly lost, and victory arriving at a cost so high it feels suspiciously like grief. Which, as franchise planning goes, is slightly more sophisticated than the traditional Hollywood model of make one, make another one, make a worst one, reboot, panic, repeat. Each phase is a self-contained movement inside the larger saga. Each film is a chapter. Very few of them are truly freestanding. That was unusual, and in truth it was almost absurdly ambitious. No other studio was operating like that. No other studio had the patience, the control, or the confidence to sacrifice short-term flexibility for long-term coherence. Feige did. And after 2015, when Isaac Perlmutter was pushed out of Marvel's creative chain and Feige began reporting directly to Disney's film leadership, he had something even more important than a strategy. He had room. There's a question that doesn't get asked often enough about Phase 1 to Phase 3 of the MCU. Why didn't it feel like a production line? Because on paper, it really should have. A franchise releasing 2 or 3 films a year, all set in the same universe, all featuring people in brightly coloured outfits hitting each other, nearly collapsing buildings, should eventually start to blur. It should start to feel like the same film wearing different helmets. But it didn't. And the reason it didn't is something Feige understood very early. They weren't making superhero films. They were making films that happened to contain superheroes. Which sounds like a small distinction, but it's the difference between building a universe and building a very expensive dressing up cupboard. Iron Man is a character study about ego, guilt, and accountability disguised as an action movie. Captain America: The First Avenger is a World War II adventure. Captain America: The Winter Soldier is a 1970s conspiracy thriller in superhero clothing. All paranoia, surveillance, and institutional rot, with the added bonus that the institution in question had been quietly nurturing a fascist infestation since 1945. Thor Ragnarok, under Taika Waititi, is a cosmic comedy. The colour palette alone, all Jack Kirby primaries, neon glare, and gladiatorial nonsense, announces that the same franchise capable of Civil War's bruised seriousness is also perfectly happy to become the brightest strange dream in multiplex history. Ant-Man is a heist film. The Guardians of the Galaxy, which we'll come back to, is a space opera road movie with a battered mixtape, a talking raccoon, and the emotional logic of a story built around childhood loss. None of that happens by accident. Those genre choices were deliberate, and so were the directors. By the time the MCU hit Phase 2 and Phase 3, Feige wasn't hiring people to flatten themselves into a house style. He was hiring them to find something inside that house style that nobody else had found yet. The Russo Brothers came out of television, Arrested Development, Community, and brought a very particular tonal skill, the ability to let comedy and consequence occupy the same frame without either cancelling out the other. That became central to the Captain America films and eventually to the wider MCU. James Gunn came from low-budget horror comedies. He understood that absurdity only works if the feeling underneath it is real. That you can put a joke next to grief, and if you do it properly, each one sharpens the other. Marvel spent years trying to bottle that trick after Guardians. Ryan Coogler gave Black Panther political focus, cultural specificity, and a visual identity rooted in Afrofuturism that made it feel like it belonged to the MCU and also stood apart from it at the same time. Taika Waititi looked at Thor: The Dark World, a film so committed to being solemn it made Norse mythology feel like admin, and rebuilt the thing from the floorboards up. What Feige built was not a formula, it was a framework. A formula gives you repetition, a framework gives you room. Room for different directors to make genuinely different films inside the same overall machine, without those films ever feeling disconnected from the larger story. That's the part most studios missed when they tried to copy the MCU. They saw the interconnected universe and copied the architecture. They built the corridors, put up the signs, announced 17 future projects, and then discovered they'd forgotten to put any actual rooms inside the building. They didn't copy the thing that made the architecture worth living in. In the spring of 2012, while the Avengers were finishing post-production and preparing to make roughly all the money on Earth, Kevin Feige was making another decision. He was going to make Guardians of the Galaxy. Now, if you know Marvel from the films, you know what the Guardians are. Peter Quill, Gamora, Drax, Rocket, Groot. 5 chaotic space idiots thrown together by circumstance, bad decisions, and eventually a kind of reluctant decency. A cosmic adventure with a battered 70s and 80s soundtrack, actual emotional weight under the jokes, and one of the strongest openings in the entire franchise. However, if you were a general audience member in 2012, you'd never heard of any of them.
Who's that?
The Guardians were not a marquee Marvel property, not even remotely close. They were a second-tier cosmic team whose 2008 comic reboot had earned genuine affection amongst comic readers and almost no recognition outside that world. The film's lead characters include a talking raccoon, Rocket, a small heavily armoured mammal with the emotional regulation of someone processing abandonment trauma through sarcasm, theft, and occasional ballistic overreaction. And then there was Groot, a walking tree, a sentient houseplant with limbs, a character whose entire spoken vocabulary consists of one sentence, "I am Groot." This is what Marvel Studios was putting a serious slice of its Phase 2 money behind. A space film, built around characters nobody knew, fronted by a raccoon and a tree.
I am Groot.
If a studio executive in 2012 had been asked to design a safe billion-dollar franchise prospect, they would not have come back with traumatized raccoon and emotionally available shrub. And this was important because in 2012 the machine was working, but it wasn't yet invincible. Iron Man had worked, Thor had worked, Captain America had worked. The Avengers was about to work on a historic scale. But Guardians was a different kind of gamble. It was a test, not whether Guardians could work, whether the MCU brand had become larger than any individual property inside it, whether the words Marvel Studios had gathered enough trust, enough goodwill, enough accumulated cultural credit that the audience would turn up for characters they'd never heard of simply because the machine introducing them was one they already believed in. Guardians of the Galaxy opened in August 2014. It made $773 million worldwide, on characters most of the audience knew nothing about before they walked into the cinema, with a talking raccoon and a monosyllabic sentient tree. The machine passed the test. And from that point on, the MCU was no longer just a successful superhero franchise in the old sense. It was a cinematic universe with its own internal memory, its own emotional history, its own audience investment that could be transferred from one set of characters to another. In other words, it had become the thing comics had already been for decades, only now it was happening on screen. And for anybody still wondering how catastrophically Marvel undersold itself in the 1990s, Rocket Raccoon alone wound up attached to a film worth more at the global box office than the entire original sale price of Spider-Man's movie rights. Just the raccoon. Here's what Avengers: Infinity War required creatively. It required Marvel Studios to take a decade of audience investment, 18 films of character work, emotional history, and relationships built in the margins between battles, and cash it in. Not redeem it, cash it in. The snap, Thanos completing the Infinity Gauntlet, clicking his fingers, wiping out half of life in the universe, was not a cliffhanger designed to be casually reversed 5 minutes into the next film. It was the payoff to a story that had been building since 2012. It was the villain winning, completely. No last-minute rescue, no sudden reversal, no hero dragging victory back from the brink through force of will and good posture. Thanos won. And the cost of that decision was enormous. They were asking audiences to sit in a cinema and watch Peter Parker dissolve in Tony Stark's arms, and then go home, live with it, and come back in a year. They were asking them to trust that this meant something. That it wasn't a trick, that it wasn't empty spectacle, that the studio had earned the right to break your heart and leave the room. There isn't really a precedent for that in modern blockbuster cinema. Anthony and Joe Russo, who had been steering the MCU since The Winter Soldier, together with writers Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely, spent years figuring out how to make that ending land. Infinity War and Endgame were planned as one giant concluding movement, written in tandem, shot largely together, built across an ensemble so large it sounded less like a cast list and more like an evacuation register. At a certain point, the call sheet probably needed its own call sheet. And then came Endgame, the resolution. It opened in April 2019, 3 hours and 1 minute long, the longest film in MCU history. A film where the surviving heroes tear holes in time to try and undo the snap. A film where Tony Stark, who began this whole story in a cave in Afghanistan, building a suit out of scrap because nothing else was available to him, finally gets the ending his character had been walking towards for more than a decade. He takes the stones, he snaps his fingers, and he dies doing it. I am Iron Man. Avengers Endgame made $2,798 million worldwide. For a brief stretch, it became the highest grossing film in cinema history. But the remarkable thing was never just the scale. It was that the ending worked. Emotionally, completely, without cheating. That weight was not manufactured for the final act. It had been earned across 10 years. Because audiences had watched Tony Stark evolve from the most selfish man in any room into someone capable of giving up everything. That arc, that payoff, that level of trust between storyteller and audience. This is what Kevin Feige built. This is the house that Iron Man built. The silence after Endgame was different from the silence after Infinity War. Infinity War ended in disbelief. Endgame ended in grief. Both were earned. Both were planned.
American homeowners are sitting on $30 trillion in home equity. But home insurance is up over 100% since 2010. Healthcare, childcare, property taxes, all up. But wages? Just stuck. Lots of equity, but feeling the squeeze. Every month they wonder why it still feels so tight. Unlock thinks we need to talk about this more. Start at unlock.com/equity. Unlock Home Equity Solutions and MLS 2657081.
Here's the problem with building the perfect machine. Sooner or later, it has to keep running after the thing it was built to do is finished. The MCU Kevin Feige designed in the mid-2000s was built to tell a specific story. The Infinity Saga. A story about flawed, difficult, deeply incompatible people coming together, breaking apart, finding each other again, and ultimately sacrificing everything to stop a cosmic act of genocide. 22 films, 11 years, with a narrative structure borrowed directly from comics. The long build, the crossover event, the ending that reorders everything that came before it. That story ended in April 2019. And then, 3 months later, Spider-Man Far From Home arrived in cinemas, because the machine does not stop for mourning. Endgame was still playing theatrically. Audiences were still processing it. Marvel was already on to the next release. That's not a criticism, it's just the structural logic of a franchise operating at this scale. The schedule doesn't pause, the franchise produces. Phase 4 was shaped by two different things at once. The first was Disney+, which launched in November 2019 and changed the economics of the MCU completely. Marvel was no longer just making films, it was now making television series. WandaVision, The Falcon and Winter Soldier, Loki, Hawkeye, Moon Knight, Miss Marvel, She-Hulk, designed not as side material but as part of the same ongoing text. Characters introduced on streaming moved into the films. Events from the shows mattered in the theatrical releases. The borders between cinema and television stopped being borders at all, and sometimes that produced genuinely exciting work. WandaVision was brilliant, a formal experiment disguised as franchise television built around grief denial and sitcom language. Loki had some of that old Marvel energy too. Wit, invention, momentum, the pleasure of watching the universe open up again. But stitching the show directly into the films created a new problem. The homework problem. And no one likes homework, especially when the homework is 6 episodes, 2 post-credit scenes, 1 mid-season variant, and a YouTube explainer titled Why the Chair in Episode 4 Changes Everything. During the Infinity Saga, you could miss entries and still keep up. The films were connected, but they were also legible on their own. The wider universe was a reward, not a requirement. Phase 4 changed that. To fully understand Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, it helped a great deal to have seen WandaVision. To track the larger shape of the franchise, you increasingly needed to have been watching everything. Marvel was rewarding the devoted audience, but it was also starting to exhaust the casual one. And the experience of fandom began to change. It stopped feeling for some people like the pleasure of following a great set of films that happened to be connected. It started to feel like maintenance. Like the MCU had become less a film series and more a gym membership for continuity or a subscription service with revision notes.
What?
The second problem is more fundamental. The Infinity Saga always had a destination. Even when the route wandered, the destination remained visible. The Avengers, Thanos, the Gauntlet, the Endpoint. They were always heading somewhere. Phase 4 made the deliberate choice to do something else first, though. Expand before it contracted. New characters, new mythologies, new corners of the multiverse, new tonal experiments. Some of that worked, some of it didn't. The Eternals struggled to turn cosmology into drama. Thor: Love and Thunder pushed self-parody so hard it started to dissolve its own emotional stakes in real time, like somebody had accidentally left the plot slightly too close to an improv canon. And all of it was happening in public, with every wobble immediately discussed, dissected, memified and judged online. The machine was still running, but it no longer seemed entirely sure where it was going. It had lost the thing that made the earlier version feel inevitable. It had lost its target. The target, when it finally emerged, was Kang the Conqueror, a time-traveling villain stretched across the multiverse, a character with the scale, flexibility, and narrative reach to become the next Thanos, the next center of gravity, the next figure around whom an entire saga could organize itself. Jonathan Majors was cast in the role. He arrived first in Loki, then moved to the center of Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, positioned as the opening move of Phase 5, the moment the next threat stopped being theoretical and became concrete. It was a sensible plan. Majors had presence. Kang had scale. The architecture was visible again. And then it broke. In December 2023, Jonathan Majors was convicted of assault and harassment. Marvel, which had built a meaningful portion of its next saga around that performance and that character, had to make a decision quickly. Marvel dropped him. There was no visible version of the machine that could keep building around him. And creatively, that left a massive problem. Because the multiverse saga, the story the MCU had been trying to assemble since Endgame, had just lost its central villain. The figure that was meant to anchor the next era was gone. The connective tissue for the next several years of storytelling suddenly had to be pulled apart and reconstructed, while films and series already released had established Kang as the threat. That's the danger of long-form architecture. When your villain is also your calendar, your roadmap, your trailer button, and the thing half your future titles are quietly pointing at, losing him is not a casting problem, it's a load-bearing wall problem. When it works, it feels inevitable. When it breaks everywhere at once. And the timing couldn't have been worse. Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania underperformed at the box office. Then the Marvels arrived later in 2023 and posted the lowest domestic opening weekend in MCU history. The franchise was still moving, but now it was running on trust accumulated during a previous era. Stored goodwill, leftover momentum, the memory of a version of itself that had once felt unshakably sure-footed. The headlines said the MCU was in trouble. That was true, but vague. The more precise version is, the MCU no longer seemed certain of where it was going. And that certainty, more than any individual hero, villain, or MacGuffin, had been the real superpower all along.
American homeowners are sitting on $30 trillion in home equity. But home insurance is up over 100% since 2010. Healthcare, childcare, property taxes, all up. But wages? Just stuck. Lots of equity, but feeling the squeeze. Every month they wonder why it still feels so tight. Unlock thinks we need to talk about this more. Start at unlock.com/equity. Unlock home equity solutions and MLS 2657081.
At San Diego Comic-Con in July 2024, Kevin Feige walked out onto the Hall H stage and did something almost nobody in the room was expecting. He announced that Robert Downey Jr. was returning to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, not as Tony Stark. Tony Stark is dead, and to Marvel's credit, the franchise has held that line. But as Doctor Doom, Victor Von Doom, Marvel's greatest villain, a scientist, a sorcerer, a monarch, a megalomaniac with an iron mask, an iron will, and somewhat like Thanos, the unnerving habit of occasionally making arguments just coherent enough to become inconvenient. Doctor Doom is not subtle. Doctor Doom is what happens when ego, genius, trauma, monarchy, magic, and a superiority complex all fill out the same LinkedIn profile. And now it was being played by the man who spent 12 years embodying the heroic center of the franchise. The face of the MCU, recast as its next great antagonist. The reaction inside Hall H was immediate and enormous. Not polite applause, not the delayed murmur of people carefully evaluating the corporate strategy. Shock, delight, the kind of pure theatrical uproar that you only get when a franchise manages, however briefly, to make itself feel dangerous again. The MCU appears to have a new, unexpected but solid destination. Avengers Doomsday and Avengers Secret Wars are no longer just future titles on a release calendar. They are being positioned as the next great convergence point. The Russo Brothers are back. The Fantastic Four, lost in the rights chaos of the 1990s, are finally back inside the Marvel studio machine. The X-Men, with the Fox acquisition absorbed into Disney, are no longer just waiting at the edge of the story. They're being pulled into the machinery too. The pieces sold off in desperation are slowly coming home. Or at least that is the promise. The architecture is being rebuilt. What Feige built at Marvel was never just scale. It was trust, built slowly, film by film, payoff by payoff. The confidence that if you kept showing up, the story would reward your attention. That the people making it knew where they were going. That the time you gave them would mean something in the end. That was the real engine. Not the spectacle or the merchandise, not even the characters on their own. Trust. And the challenge of the year since Endgame has been what happens when the story that trust was built for is over. But the machine has to keep moving anyway. Whether this new version works, whether the machine that once delivered Endgame can find that level again, is the question that will define the next decade of Marvel storytelling. And Feige, for better or worse, is doing what he's always done. Building. He built the first version of this machine under pressure, against interference, with characters nobody wanted, on a $525 million gamble that could have ended the company. He built something that held for 11 years, something that paid off across 22 films, something that, at its peak, didn't just dominate popular culture, but reorganized it. And now he's trying to build the next version. Because once you've trained the audience to expect the next door to open, you don't get to say, actually, we're just going to enjoy the hallway for a bit. This is the real cost of success at this scale. The house has to keep expanding. And that isn't a complaint. But that is where this season's real question begins. Because once geek culture proves it can build the biggest house in Hollywood, every studio, streamer, retailer and platform starts asking how to build one of their own. It's just what happens when you build the house everybody else wants to move into. I'm Dave from Geektown, and this has been Geekstorians. For more on this and plenty other geeky stuff, head to geektown.co.uk. And if you haven't already, check out Geektown Radio, our weekly podcast covering the latest TV, film, and gaming. If you enjoy Geekstorians, leave a review wherever you listen. It really does help other people find the show. Until next time, we'll see you then.
American homeowners are sitting on $30 trillion in home equity. But home insurance is up over 100% since 2010. Healthcare, childcare, property taxes, all up. But wages? Just stuck. Lots of equity, but feeling the squeeze. Every month they wonder why it still feels so tight. Unlock thinks we need to talk about this more. Start at unlock.com/equity. Unlock Home Equity Solutions, NMLS 2657081.